Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone from Learn, Do, Share inviting me and all the work that you've done to organize this. And I was part of the, dropped in yesterday too, what you were all working on. So again, it's going to be fun to see not only what was produced yesterday, but hopefully will be produced at the end of today and the rest of Learn, Do, Share. So can everyone hear me okay? So I'm Dean of Strategic Initiatives at Columbia University, which means I help a lot of people, both hopefully within Columbia and outside of Columbia, working together to figure out solutions to many different challenges. So here today, I'm here to talk about really imagining the future of cities. And hopefully what I want to do is hopefully collectively think with you actually what the future of cities is going to look like. To do that, though, first, I want to try to frame this in sort of a kind of a methodological framework. It's, I think, me being an academic. So I want to briefly tell you a story. So this is the first day of my graduate school. A professor comes in and he says, every great graduate student should do this. And we thought maybe produce art like this. No. So what he was trying to say is that to actually understand the world, we actually need to understand it through various perspectives. So the beauty of cubism is within a two-dimensional framework, you get to see actually a multitude of perspectives. So that's what we should really try to do. It's not one specific rendering of reality. You really want to try to stitch together many different ones. And to actually understand that too, I think you also need to understand what sort of biases do you bring as you're trying to stitch together an understanding of the world around you? So I'm going to just briefly tell you sort of my personal journey. So I was actually an aerospace engineer as an undergraduate. And there's something very unique about engineers. We think we can solve all the world's problems just by tinkering and figuring things out. So I have a little bit of that in me. Luckily, I didn't stop there. I actually then hung out with a bunch of artists. I actually worked at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And this is actually the East Wing, which is actually the modern part of the museum. So actually, I got to see every day what actually real creativity was about and how people created beautiful works of art. And you also recognize that a lot of the people, when they were producing it, were not celebrated or appreciated. I think anyone that reads Letters to Theo, which is Vincent van Gogh's letters to his brother, you realize the pain and vulnerability that anyone that's trying to be creative actually goes through. So that was a great experience. And then after that, I actually ended up going to Columbia to get my PhD, but actually it wasn't in the sciences. It actually was in political science. So I then got a deep appreciation for the social sciences, so understanding how socially we interact, the underlying sort of mechanisms that cause us to sort of act and decide the way we do. And that was a great experience. And then I thought I was going to be a professor for the rest of my life. And then I actually ended up getting a little bit of the startup bug. So I ended up starting actually a few technology companies, and both back in 2000, which was a lot of fun. So this is, if you remember, before 2000, there really was nothing called Wi-Fi. There was nothing called, high-speed internet. We had to bring in T1 lines. It was a very unique period to start up companies. And then now, actually, if you're starting up a company now, it's just radically changed. There's Wi-Fi. There's things in the cloud that you can do. There's collaborative stuff. So this is sort of my methodological journey. And I think if I could sum it up, I would say if it was, I'm talking about sort of a cubist palette for a methodological framework, I would say I'm a historical, institutional, comparative ecologist. So I'm going to use this framework to try to understand what the future of cities may look like. So again, I want you to sort of think about this, and I think I'll really try to engage you in a conversation about what this can be. So when we say imagine future cities, and thinking about kind of your own methodological journeys, how you got to this point, what do you think when I say imagine future cities? What sort of, is it purely on a geographical? Do you sort of reimagine cities purely sort of in an architectural rendering? Is that sort of your narrative? Do you see it more on the economic side, how things are changing? Do you see it more on the civic, political side? Do you see it on the social side? So I think it's an interesting exercise for you. When I say these words, what actually comes to mind? How do you sort of understand that phrasing of future cities? So my sort of framework is going to be to look at it from the past, present, and future. So I think that's always a good way to understand anytime you're talking about the future, to sort of try to stitch it within this narrative framework. So let me quickly go through a quick history of cities, and not really the origins, but what I want to do is actually just kind of chronicle what were the top 10 cities just by the number of people. And we'll start actually in 100 AD. You've probably seen these sort of top 10 lists all the time, but I think what I want you to try to do is imagine in these cities, yes, there's 450,000 people, but just try to imagine, because one thing that hasn't changed from that time to this time is actually time itself. There's 24 hours in a day. That hasn't changed if you're in 100 AD or if you're in 2015. So just imagine what literally sort of a minute by minute day was like for people living in 100 AD, when they got up in the morning, what they did, the friends that they saw. I mean, and, at that time, there were people that they probably hated, that they liked. Someone was a jerk, someone was funny. So these characteristics, I think, were always present in cities. So it's interesting to see the top 10 cities in 100 AD. And you see it changing in 1000 AD. And again, it's just interesting to see sort of geographically where some of these larger cities were in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia as well. And you see the numbers increasing. And then you go to 1500 AD, you see the numbers getting higher. And then again, you see the geographic changes also occurring at that time. You jump 300 years later to 1800. Now you start to see the United Kingdom in there, but again, it's very still dominated by much of the East. And then you jump just literally 100 years later, and you get a radically reordering of the cities. You see it jumping all the way up to 6 million, and then you start to see it much more dominated by the United States and what's happening in Europe. And then you just jump again 100 years later, and now you see things actually changing again. You see actually Europe and the U.S. sort of dying out, and you see what's happening again across in the South America, Asia as well. So again, it's very interesting to see how cities have changed. So like why do you see all these changes? Why isn't it constant in the ordering of cities? So again, I think it's sort of interesting. Again, what type of methodological lens do you use to try to understand this question of why change? You can just just look at it at the population numbers, why that's changing, but then you can think about the underlying dynamics. What were the interactions of the people at the time? What were the political, the social, the economic underpinnings of those cities during those times? So again, it's a fun, thought exercise. So, what are the top 10 cities in 2100 going to be? What are the top 10 cities that are going to be in 2500? And what are the top 10 cities that are going to be in 3100? Are those numbers going to keep increasing? Are they going to start to break out of the megacity trends dying? As people probably know, for the first time in human history, there is a greater people living in cities than non-cities. And that's the first time that's happened. So again, it's fun to think about, again, what is the top 10? I'm sure we're all probably going to be wrong, whatever prediction we end up making. So let me just quickly talk about the present briefly. It's interesting to kind of situate our time in history, again, to the longer arc of history. So again, I think if you think about what's happening now, with computers, with the internet. I mean, there are just massive changes that are happening just with technology. And again, as I mentioned, we just had this massive migration into cities as well. What this is also causing is actually a massive creation of wealth. We talk about the number of billionaires quintupling within a short period of time. We see all the hedge fund folks. We see all the technology billionaires being created. So again, we have just this massive creation of wealth. But coupled with that, we also have this massive rise in income inequality as well. So we see the separation of the super wealthy and the not so wealthy. And that's also occurring in our time. And then we have these levels of polarization. So in the US, where the party on the right and the party on the left sit, those two parties have actually been growing over time. So again, we have high levels of income inequality as well. So again, I think I can make a very good argument that actually this describes what we're seeing now. The interesting thing, though, is if I were to use those exact same terms, it actually describes 1915 just as well. We were going from a shift from agrarian to manufacturing. We had the Industrial Revolution that was happening. We had massive wealth being created by the Carnegies, by the JP Morgans. We had income inequality rising. And we also had political polarization increasing as well. So let me share with you this this graph. So the blue line here represents the income inequality. So it's, again, the share that the 1% has. And then the red line is this, we have this measure of congressional polarization, which is actually pretty well-defined measure of how members in the House, again, the party on the right, party on the left, how they are different from one another. So this starts from 1913 and it goes to 2013. And it's very interesting. Again, you see that we have these high levels of both income inequality during that time. And then you see it actually drop actually in the 1950s. And then you start to see it increase again. So, is history repeating itself? Are we living in a very similar period in 2015 that we were living in 2013? So again, I think it's a really interesting question to think through. So imagine, again, this is not Learn, Do, Share 2015, but this is Learn, Do, Share 1915. With all of the issues that we're facing, again, we're just embarking on the Industrial Revolution. We see all of these things that are going on. And how would you prioritize, if you're living in the urban areas, what things to focus on? Would you focus on, women's rights? There's, again, gender inequality, children's rights, the labor laws, all of the kids that were being worked incredible amounts of time, workers' rights, the hours, the labor conditions, they were working, 12, 13, 15 hours a day in incredibly tough conditions, minority rights, civic reform. There was a whole movement, progressive movement, trying to weed out corruption. So again, it's interesting. Again, if we could go back to 1915, what would you tell the people that were sitting and Learn, Do, Share 1915 from all that you know now? Would that actually help change or alter anything that happened from 1915 to what we see in 2015 in Paris? So again, it's actually a very optimistic story, though. If you think about what happened from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to now, and this is Peter Diamandis. He is very optimistic about the future. He has the book about the abundance of the future. Again, human lifespan has gone up 2x, income has gone up 3x, childhood mortality going down 10x, cost of food going down, cost of electricity going down, cost of transportation going down, cost of communication down. So again, it's a very exciting and interesting period that we had in this span of the Industrial Revolution and the impact, again, what it had on cities. So what I'm going to actually try to talk about a little bit is sort of the technology ecosystem, what's been happening in the past 10, 15 years, and actually a little bit what's happening in the more immediate, actually as potentially a signal to what the future cities can look like. So this is actually from Yochai Benkler, who's a Harvard professor, I think, who actually talks about what we're seeing in the shift that's happening in, some people say sort of the post-industrial economy, the information economy. I call it sort of the post-digital economy. But he actually has this great little couple of slides. So he talks about in the 1980s, if you remember, it was about the race for who could build the best computer, the fastest computer. So for the first time, it was actually a Japanese company that ended up building the fastest supercomputer. And you can think about, again, these big tech companies at that time, IBM, HP, NEC then built this very fast supercomputer. And then again, just from more of a nationalistic side, there's a little bit of a sigh of relief from the US because IBM actually completely, they just barely beat out the NEC Earth simulator. But what actually Yochai talks about is during that time, people sort of forget there was actually a better supercomputer built that no one really even thought about as a supercomputer. And if you remember, maybe you actually downloaded this thing, but again, sort of as a kind of a window in what the sort of post-industrial revolution could look like, there was the SETI at home. So this was a little screensaver that you could download onto your computer. And when you weren't using your computer, it would then take your idle computing time and use that to crunch these numbers to then look at the telescope that was happening over space and crunch those numbers. So if you actually collectively added the computation, it was almost twice as fast as what these bigger companies were producing at the time. And again, this is sort of the beginning of the insights into sort of collective, kind of the collective economy, the sharing economy that we hear so much about. So again, this sort of open and sharing economy. And actually what Yochai talks about is actually we are, for the first time, moving, just like what we saw in 1915 as a shift in the Industrial Revolution, and all of the things, the management, the organization that was built around the Industrial Revolution and how work and transactions were being developed. Yochai talks about actually for the first time what the internet is allowing us to do is to create this additional window. So if you look at this, it's sort of centralized, which is you have firms, you have governments, nonprofits. You have a decentralized system, which is sort of the pricing system. How do we get prices for various products? And he says the first time in human history, we are actually able to create this non-market. So the social sharing and exchange and a decentralized. And again, the internet and the tools that we have is allowing us to do this for the first time. So if you think about, I'm not sure how many of you know the Apache web server. So it really is the backbone for the internet. It allows, it's the server that allows us, the software that allows us to handle the web development. So the Apache web server is actually just a band of people volunteering their time to produce this particular product. And on the other side, again, you have Microsoft, this behemoth. And again, if you think about it more in the 1990s when this was first starting, you would automatically say that Windows would completely destroy a bunch of volunteers working during their independent time to work on this. And Yochai actually has this great graph where Apache during in the early 2000s actually had 70% of the market share compared to Microsoft. So the internet really is this platform to allow people to start sharing with one another. And again, if you think about a company like Instagram, 12 people, Kodak going out of business, how radically, again, something like Kodak that represents the Industrial Revolution and something like Instagram that represents the post-industrial revolution. And then again, if you think about the internet plus mobile as an additional platform, you think about all of the things that we can now create. So if you're familiar in the tech world, there's the LAMP stack, which again, it's all open source, coupled with Amazon Web Services. It's almost nominal actually to start a company. If you have the right tools in place, if you have the right collection of the creative and talented people, you can start to create all of these companies that we've seen in the past year that's radically, fundamentally changing, again, how work is performed and being paid as well. So again, I think you can really think about the city as a platform, and it is this platform where it allows very creative people to come together and start to produce something very unique. And again, before in the Industrial Revolution, the cost to produce anything along those lines, that probably was the barrier to entry. You needed 5 million, 100. The startup capital to do any of this was extremely high. But again, now because of what we're seeing in the past few years, that's radically come down. So you can, again, come together and create something very unique and interesting. So again, it's about sort of creative collective entrepreneurship in the city. It's, I think, creative communities that you can create from this. And then again, in the creative economy that's coming out of it. So again, when we think about the future cities, I have no idea what the top 10 is going to be. But when I think about the characteristics of what a vibrant, exciting city is going to be, I think about, again, it's going to be an open city. But I think coupled with that, you need to understand that with open, really the underlying mechanism to have it open is it has to be dynamic. It can't be open and static. It has to be constantly changing, but you have to have that framework that allows the dynamic openness to occur. It has to be creative. But again, when I mentioned the letters to Theo, you need to understand the underlying mechanism to having a creative society is to understand and recognize the importance of vulnerability and protecting that as well. You need to understand, again, it's going to be an innovative city, but the underlying mechanism for innovation is actually failure. So again, if you think about the city that you say that has the most innovative startups in the world, you say Silicon Valley. But you can flip that question. You say, well, what city has the most failures in tech startups? By far, it's Silicon Valley. So again, you need to understand, again, the underlying mechanism. You can be innovative, but the underlying mechanism to get and be innovative is the amount of failure that you have as well. And again, to be collaborative and collaborate, I think the underlying mechanism to that is to have empathy. You need to then, again, be empathetic to those around you. And I think these, again, are the characteristics for what I'm imagining the future city. So it's going to be learn, do, share, and all the characteristics that learn, do, share has in 2015, 2020, 2050. So the cities, I think, that embrace those things are going to be, I think, a pretty prosperous and exciting city. Thank you.